As we continue talking about cell organelles, we'll now talk about the organelles involved in energy production and release of energy for the cell to use. The mitochondrion is the organelle that is involved in producing energy from energy storage molecules like carbohydrates for the cell to use. It does this by means of the process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is a chemical process that releases, that breaks down sugars and releases energy in the form of ATP, which is a molecule that cells use to transfer energy from place to place. The structure of the mitochondrion includes a double membrane on the outside. The internal membrane has these embedded proteins that are involved in the cellular respiration process, functioning in this process to synthesize or produce ATP. The inner membrane is also folded back and forth into cristae to increase the surface area for these molecules to do their work. And then inside that is a matrix, which is kind of like the cytoplasm of the mitochondrion, which contains ribosomes that are present in the mitochondrion, as well as mitochondrial DNA. That is, both the ribosomes and the mitochondrial DNA are different than the ribosomes and DNA found in the rest of the cell. This shows you a micrograph of a mitochondrion here. You can see the double membrane on the outside and the cristae folded on the inside. In the diagram, you can see how these are arranged, and there's a space in between the membranes called the intermembrane space, which is very important in the process of producing the ATP. So we'll learn a little bit more about that later on. Another organelle involved in energy production is the chloroplast. Chloroplasts are found in plant cells and algae cells, and they are involved in converting solar energy to chemical energy. They can use the energy of sunlight to change carbon dioxide and water into sugars that can then be stored as starches for cells to use later on. You find chloroplasts in all photosynthetic eukaryotes, including plants and algae, and there are some other protista as well as other algae that contain chloroplasts. The chloroplast also has a double membrane, like we talked about with the mitochondrion, and it has a thick fluid on the inside. The fluid is called the stroma, which is kind of like the cytoplasm of the mitochondrion. The stroma contains ribosomes and chloroplast DNA, sort of like we saw in the mitochondrion. And there are also these internal membranes called thylakoid membranes, which are the site of the reactions of photosynthesis. And again, we'll learn some more about how this process works and where these embedded proteins work together to produce these, as well as the enzyme systems to produce these storage molecules of sugars and starches. Here's a diagram. This is a micrograph of a chloroplast, as well as a diagram of a chloroplast showing you the structure on the inside. You've got the outer membrane and the inner membrane, and then the stroma is the fluid on the inside, kind of like the matrix was in the mitochondrion. And then on the inside, you've got these stacks of membranes called thylakoids, where the chlorophyll is located and where the beginning part of the reactions of photosynthesis take place. And we'll learn a lot more details about how this works in a future unit. Now, you might wonder why chloroplasts and mitochondria have their own DNA and their own ribosomes. That's separate from the cell. It's totally different from the cell's DNA and the cell's mitochondrion. When you look at them closely, what you start to see is that the DNA in mitochondria and chloroplasts is similar to the DNA that you find in prokaryotes like bacteria. The ribosomes that you find in mitochondria and chloroplasts are also similar to prokaryotic ribosomes. Not only that, they also reproduce themselves separate from the cell reproducing itself in a process similar to what bacteria do by means of binary fission or splitting in half. And so now we understand that these organisms formerly were actually small prokaryotes that were incorporated into or engulfed into larger cells and began living within them as symbionts, living as in a symbiotic relationship and eventually becoming part of the host cell. This diagram shows you the genesis of that theory, that maybe you had a host cell here that had some stuff going on and it engulfed or ate this oxygen-using prokaryote, discovered, I guess you could say, that it was an advantage to keep it within it producing more energy than just breaking it down and releasing the molecules that it was composed of, and eventually became a symbiont within that cell. Later on, some of those cells also engulfed a photosynthetic prokaryote, which became the chloroplast in the same sort of fashion. And we'll do an activity in class related to the endosymbiotic theory so you can see the genesis of this theory and some of the evidence supporting it. Other structures that cells have are cytoskeletons. Cytoskeletons are composed of several different kinds of fibers that you find inside all cells, including prokaryotes and eukaryotes. There are three main kinds of fibers. There are microfilaments, which are protein threads of a protein called actin. Microfilaments are involved in giving the cell shape and support and allowing for things to move around inside the cell. Also, when cells move, some cells move that by means of flagella or cilia, extensions of the cell membrane. These extensions are made of microfilaments as well. The second kind of filament is an intermediate filament, and these are more rope-like in structure. They help anchor the nucleus in place and help maintain the shape of the cell. A third filament that's found in cells, or part of the cytoskeleton, is a microtubule. Microtubules are made of a protein called tubulin, and they are hollow tubes, just like you might guess from the name. They're involved in anchoring parts of the cell in place and also providing tracks to move things within the cell. So that between the microtubules and the microfilaments, that accounts for movement within the cell. And then the microfilaments are also involved in movement of the cell itself. Animal cells and some fungal cells have these structures called centrioles that help organize the microtubules within the cells, and they also assist in cell division, and we'll talk about them a little bit more when we talk about cell division later on. Here's kind of what the structures look like in the cell. These diagrams have been stained in a special way to show just those structures. So this shows these red structures here are the microfilaments made of actin. You can see there it looks like a kind of a twisted rope or twisted thread. Actin is also involved in contraction of your muscle cells, so it's involved in a lot of things about movement of cells and of organs themselves. The intermediate filament, it looks more like a rope. It's got all these twisted fibers together, and it kind of helps, again, anchor things in place and maintain the cell shape. You can see them stained in green here. And then finally the microtubules that actually are little tubes that are made of this tubulin protein that kind of spirals around and forms a tube, and they form another structure or a series of structures within the cell to put things in place, keep things in place. This picture kind of shows you several things together. The red fibers are actin filaments, the green are the microtubules, and the blue thing that you see here in the middle is the nucleus. Now some cells have these structures called cilia and flagella, and these are involved in moving the cell itself. They are made of microtubules with some of these other motor proteins that are embedded in them, and they move by bending the tubules back and forth. This shows the basic structure of a cilium or a flagellum. They're pretty much the same in the structure. Cilia are shorter and flagella are much longer. And you'll see there's some central microtubules, and then there are these pairs arranged in a circular fashion around those, and there are proteins connecting them that are contractile proteins that can move the fiber from one side to the other. Outside the cell, outside the plasma membrane, there's also something called an extracellular matrix, or ECM. These are structures that are important to a lot of different cell functions, but they're not really inside the cell itself. It kind of holds cells together, helps protect and support the membrane. A lot of the things located in the extracellular matrix include glycoproteins, which are proteins that have a carbohydrate chain attached to them. There are also fibers like collagen that you've heard of before that gives kind of a supporting network to the cells as a group. And then there are these other proteins called integrins that are proteins that extend through the membrane that are involved in the transmission of signals from one cell to the next. Here's a picture kind of showing you what the extracellular matrix would look like. Okay, you can see the internal structures of the cell here, including the microfilaments and these integrin proteins that are located here, as well as some glycoproteins with some carbohydrate chains attached, and then other structures like the collagen fibers that kind of give a matrix to the area outside the cell. There's a lot of communication between cells that goes on by moving a molecule from here to there, and the extracellular matrix is involved in some of that signaling process as well. Now in animal cells, you've got adjacent cells that interact with each other and communicate with each other, and the places where they're connected are called junctions. There are three main kinds of junctions you can see illustrated here. The tight junction, you can see here, looks like this, and that kind of helps prevent leakage of fluid out of the cell. It kind of forms a boundary that keeps fluids more inside the cells or in the sheet of cells. We have anchoring junctions that basically function to anchor cells together in sheets, like so when you have a tissue that's a sheet of the same kind of cells, the anchoring junctions would anchor those or hold those together. And then we have these junctions called gap junctions. Gap junctions are just what they sound like. They're a gap between cells from one cell to the next, and that allows some molecules to move directly from one cell into the next one. Plant cells also have junctions. Of course, plant cells have a cell wall, which is a rigid structure of cellulose that provides support and protection to the cell. But then in order to communicate between cells, they have these little openings called plasmodesmata. One is called a plasmodesma, and they allow for water and minerals and other signaling molecules of various kinds to pass from one cell to the next. And that concludes our learning about cell organelles.